A glimpse of desperation. The Emberfield rest stop sat quiet, nestled along a lonely stretch of highway where the flatlands stretched for miles. It was a place most travelers breezed through, pausing only long enough to refuel or grab a quick coffee. The rest stop's diner was modest, a faded relic from another era, with its chipped vinyl booths, flickering neon sign, and the warm hum of fluorescent lights. On this chilly evening, the few patrons inside sat scattered across the booths and counter seats, oblivious to the unfolding tension beneath the seemingly ordinary scene. Michael Caine, a retired Marine with a rigid posture and the sharp gaze of a seasoned soldier, strolled into the diner, scanning the room with a practiced eye. He had been on the road for hours, carrying memories of places he was glad to leave behind and aches in his body that never fully disappeared. The rest stop promised a quick break, but his instincts whispered that something was off. His gaze settled on a booth by the window, where a young black girl, no more than 8, sat opposite a middle-aged white man in a crisp suit. The girl wore a bright pink dress that looked recently ironed, its color a stark contrast against her downcast face and fidgeting hands. Her hair was tied in neat braids, and her eyes darted around the room, barely settling on any one person or object. She looked as if she was trying to fold into herself, her small body tense and uncomfortable. The man sitting across from her appeared calm, but there was a rigidness in his expression, a hard-set line of his mouth that clashed with his supposedly casual demeanor. Michael's gaze met the girl's for a split second, and he noticed her swallow nervously, her small fingers tracing invisible patterns on the table. She glanced at the man in the suit, whose eyes were glued to a newspaper. It might have looked like an innocent scene, but Michael's instincts screamed otherwise. He could feel it in the air, something tense and hidden. He shook off his unease, reminding himself he was here for a quick coffee and nothing more. But as he stepped towards the counter, he positioned himself where he could keep the pair in his periphery. Years of military service had taught him that the gut knew things the mind couldn't always explain. He waited for the server, leaning against the counter as he observed the girl and her silent distress. The girl's small hand lifted from her lap, her palm facing out, fingers splayed in an odd, subtle gesture. It was an instinctual move, and Michael recognized it at once. A silent plea for help. It was a common signal he'd seen in high-stress situations overseas. He felt his breath hitch. Was he seeing things? Was this really what it looked like? He remembered the last time he had ignored his instincts. It had cost lives. He knew he wouldn't let himself repeat that mistake. Not here, not now. As Michael watched, he noticed the girl's face tense, her fingers moving with a shaky rhythm. The man across from her glanced over his newspaper at her with a stern, narrow-eyed look. The girl stilled, her hands dropping to her lap, and she turned her gaze back to the window. He could feel his heartbeat quickening, the steady pulse of adrenaline that came right before action. But this wasn't a battlefield. He was in a diner. He couldn't barge over there without solid evidence. He couldn't assume things based only on a look. He took a steadying breath, then moved casually to a nearby booth, close enough to catch snippets of conversation, if there were any. His heart thudded in his chest as he waited, every part of him on high alert, like a tightly coiled spring. The man in the suit continued reading, his demeanor casual, though his eyes occasionally flickered to the girl with an intensity that set Michael on edge. As Michael lingered, he noticed the girl shift in her seat, glancing around as if measuring an escape route. Though her gaze didn't linger on the door, she looked back at Michael briefly, and in her eyes, he saw something that tugged at his conscience, a quiet but desperate hope, barely hanging on. He hadn't spoken to them, hadn't approached, but something within him wouldn't let him walk away. Shadows and signals. Michael's gaze remained fixed on the pair at the booth, his coffee cooling untouched in his hand. The soft murmurs and clinks of the diner around him faded as his mind honed in on the girl in pink and the man with the newspaper. Every fiber of his instincts shouted that this wasn't right, but he had learned to be cautious with gut feelings. Jumping to conclusions in his line of work could mean disaster, yet ignoring the signs could mean something worse. Tonight, he couldn't afford to be wrong. Michael settled into his booth, pretending to scroll through his phone while keeping an eye on the man. The girl looked down at her lap, her shoulders slumped in a posture that was too resigned for a child. Michael could tell she was trying to remain invisible, as if any movement might draw unwanted attention. The man in the suit kept reading, but he seemed too aware of the girl, his eyes darting to her every so often with an unsettling possessiveness. It felt as though she were more object than person to him, and the sight made Michael's skin crawl. After a few tense minutes, the man lowered his newspaper and leaned toward the girl. Michael strained to catch what he was saying, but the man's words were spoken too quietly. Whatever he said, it made the girl shrink into herself even more, her head bowing low, and she hugged her small arms around her chest protectively. The man's face remained hard, his mouth twisted into a tight line. He lifted his newspaper again, effectively shutting her out, but the effect was deliberate, as though reminding her of her place. Michael could feel the tension in his own muscles building. He was too far away to hear anything concrete, but his instincts told him enough. He needed to find a reason to get closer, to get a better look, and maybe even an opening to talk to the girl. He debated his options, careful to weigh every move, knowing that one wrong step could send the situation spiraling. He spotted the waitress, a young woman with a tired smile, clearing tables near the booth where the man and girl sat. Seizing the opportunity, he stood and made his way over, feigning interest in the vending machines beside their table. Michael could hear faint sounds, a rustling paper, the man's deep, measured breaths, and barely above a whisper, the girl's soft sigh. "Can I get a refill here?" he asked the waitress as she wiped down a nearby table. His voice was casual, but his attention remained locked on the small scene behind him. The waitress nodded, disappearing momentarily to grab the coffee pot. Michael stole a quick glance over his shoulder, just as the girl lifted her hand slightly off the table, repeating the subtle gesture she'd made earlier, palm out, fingers spread wide. This time, the movement was more deliberate, and her eyes flicked up to Michael for the briefest moment. There it was, confirmation. This wasn't a nervous habit. She was signaling, trying to communicate in a way she hoped wouldn't be noticed by the man. Michael's heart pounded, his military training kicking in. He remembered similar signals used in the field when a soldier was under watch or trapped. This was a silent plea, and he couldn't ignore it. The waitress returned with his coffee, pulling him out of his thoughts. He thanked her, grabbing a sugar packet as an excuse to linger by the table a bit longer. The man lowered his newspaper again, giving Michael a wary glance, but Michael's face remained impassive. He watched as the man reached out, putting a firm hand on the girl's small arm, squeezing slightly. The girl winced but didn't look up, her eyes fixed downward, her hand clenching into a tight fist beneath the table. Michael's jaw tightened, the sight sending a rush of anger through him. He wanted to act, to confront the man directly, but he knew he had to be strategic. Approaching recklessly would only alert the man, who might leave with the girl before Michael could assess the situation fully. Instead, he turned his attention to the girl, catching her eye again as he raised his coffee in a casual, friendly gesture. To his surprise, she gave him the tiniest nod, a barely perceptible movement, but one filled with meaning. She knew he was watching, and she wanted him to know that her signal was intentional. Michael's mind raced as he calculated his options. He knew he needed to gather more information, find a way to engage the man without setting off alarms. He could already feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He couldn't walk away now, not when this child was relying on him for help. The waitress returned, collecting a few plates from nearby tables, and Michael seized the opportunity to strike up a casual conversation. "Busy night?" he asked, keeping his tone light. His eyes flicked to the man and girl, ensuring they couldn't overhear. Michael nodded thoughtfully. "I noticed the pair by the window. Do they come in often?" The waitress glanced over at the man and the girl, a slight frown creasing her forehead. "Actually, I haven't seen them before. That little girl, she seems nervous, doesn't she?" Michael didn't miss the concern in her voice, and it gave him a sense of reassurance. He wasn't the only one noticing something was off. "Yeah, she does," he replied, keeping his tone measured. "Mind if I ask, does she look like she's with him? Like family?" The waitress hesitated, looking over her shoulder as though worried she might be overheard. "I don't know. Maybe it's nothing, but something about the way he watches her gives me chills. But could be an uncle or family friend, right?" Michael's stomach churned. He knew they both felt the same discomfort, but neither of them had the luxury of simply assuming everything was okay. Too many times, people brushed off these warning signs, afraid of being wrong. But he couldn't live with himself if he left and later found out something terrible had happened. A plan started to form in his mind, and he set his coffee cup down, still keeping his expression neutral. He knew he needed to engage the man without raising suspicion, to somehow gauge his intentions. Straightening up, he walked back towards the man's table, making his steps appear casual and unhurried. As he approached, he noticed the man's hand tightening on the girl's shoulder, his grip firm and unyielding. Michael stopped just in front of the booth, offering the man a polite smile. "Evening," he said casually, nodding toward the girl. "I couldn't help but notice your daughter here looked a bit uncomfortable. Everything all right?" The man's expression stiffened, but he forced a smile. "She's fine, thanks," he replied, his voice too smooth, too polished. "She's just shy around strangers." Michael met the man's gaze, his own eyes unwavering, and for a moment, an unspoken tension hung heavy in the air. He turned his attention to the girl, offering her a reassuring smile. "It's okay, kiddo. You don't have to be shy." The girl's eyes flickered with something close to relief, but she quickly looked down, clearly afraid to engage with him too much. Michael's resolve hardened, and he turned back to the man, his posture relaxed but his gaze sharp. "Well, if you're sure everything's good," Michael said lightly, his tone laced with a hint of challenge. The man's mouth twitched slightly, his discomfort showing. "Yes, we're fine," he repeated, his voice lower, almost warning. Michael gave a slight nod, pretending to back off, but his mind was working rapidly, calculating his next move. As he walked back to his table, he watched the man out of the corner of his eye, noticing how his face tightened with controlled annoyance, his hand still gripping the girl's shoulder possessively. Back at his booth, Michael's mind raced with possibilities. This was no longer a simple stopover. He was now part of something that felt ominous, something he knew he couldn't ignore. And as he watched the girl's small frame huddled against the window, he made a silent promise to himself. No matter what it took, he was going to find a way to help her. The unseen exchange. Michael sat back down, pretending to look through his phone, but his thoughts were anything but casual. His mind worked at full speed, calculating his options and the next move. Each second that ticked by only intensified his determination to intervene. Yet he knew he couldn't afford to act rashly. He couldn't risk scaring off the man or putting the girl in any more danger. His approach would need to be quiet, tactical, and deliberate. He kept his eyes on the reflection in the diner's window, using it as a makeshift mirror to observe the man and the girl without drawing attention. The man was back to his newspaper, his expression set and disinterested, though the grip he had on the girl's shoulder earlier lingered in Michael's mind. It was an invisible tether, a way of showing dominance without saying a word. He was controlling her, isolating her, and Michael knew he had to find a way to break through that invisible chain. After a moment, Michael made his way to the restroom, giving himself a brief moment to regroup. He splashed cold water on his face, staring into the mirror. He'd been trained for high-stress situations, but he'd never expected this. A potential child in danger, right here on his own soil, not in a war zone. There was a weight pressing down on his chest, and as he looked at his reflection, he made up his mind. He wouldn't be walking away from this, no matter how complex it got. Exiting the restroom, He decided to approach a different way. He spotted the cook, an older man with a grizzled beard and an apron stained from hours of work, standing by the kitchen window. Michael slipped behind the counter, catching his eye. "Excuse me," Michael said in a low voice. "You noticed the guy with the little girl by the window? Something feels off. You know them." The cook frowned, glancing over at the table before shaking his head. "Nah, don't recognize him. Why, you think something's wrong?" Michael nodded subtly, keeping his tone calm but intense. "Call it a hunch. I'm ex-military, and I've seen situations like this before." The girl seemed scared. "Could you help me keep an eye on them?" The cook's brow furrowed with concern. "I got a daughter myself. Say no more. I'll watch him from back here and keep the line open if you need a hand." Satisfied he had an extra set of eyes, Michael returned to his booth, but this time he angled himself slightly, ready to spring into action if needed. He noticed the girl glancing at him again, her eyes wide, pleading. She was trapped, and the realization sparked something fierce in him. He tapped his fingers on the table, formulating a plan. He needed a way to communicate with her, to let her know he was on her side. Standing up, he walked to the jukebox near the back of the diner, scrolling through the song options as if he were picking a tune. In reality, he was placing himself closer to their booth. He studied the girl's reflection in the glass, looking for any sign she could see him, and gave the slightest nod. To his surprise, she lifted her hand, making that same quiet distress signal, a flat palm with her fingers spread, held low by her side so the man couldn't see. It was small, almost invisible to anyone else, but to Michael it was as clear as a flare in the night. She was asking for help, trusting him with her silent cry. Michael clenched his jaw, fighting the surge of anger welling up inside. He could sense the man's carefully concealed aggression, his control over her palpable even from a distance. He needed a way to get the girl away from him, even for a moment. Just then, he had an idea. Stepping away from the jukebox, he approached their table, his face set in a polite but unwavering expression. "Hey there," he said casually, keeping his tone light. "I'm heading to the front counter to get a refill on coffee. Mind if I treat the little lady to a soda?" "On me." The man looked up, his eyes narrowing. He glanced at the girl, who looked down instantly, her face tense. "Thanks, but she's fine," he replied curtly, his words clipped, dismissive. Michael kept his smile, tilting his head slightly. "Aw, it's no trouble," he said. "Can't say no to a kid, you know." The man's eyes sharpened, his mouth pressing into a thin line. "I said, she's fine," he replied, the words carrying a hidden edge. Michael didn't push it, sensing the man's sudden irritation. Instead, he nodded and gave the girl a small, almost imperceptible wink, hoping it would comfort her, let her know he wasn't giving up. Turning away, Michael strode back to his booth, thinking through his next move. He knew he had to be careful. One wrong step could escalate the situation or scare the man off before he had a chance to act. But time was ticking, and he couldn't afford to wait much longer. Just then, he noticed a set of keys hanging from the man's jacket pocket, dangling near the edge of the booth. An idea struck him. It was risky, but if he could separate the man from the girl, even briefly, he might have a chance to talk to her. He waited until the man was focused on his newspaper again, then walked past the booth and subtly brushed against it, nudging the keys to the floor. He didn't stop, acting as if it had been a simple accident. He heard a muttered curse as the man bent down to retrieve the keys, distracted for just a moment. Michael quickly caught the girl's eye, tilting his head toward the restroom in a silent suggestion. She hesitated, looking toward the man, but when he reached down to pick up the keys, she took her chance. Without a sound, she slid out of the booth, her small form darting toward the restroom. Michael felt a surge of relief. Now, if he could keep the man distracted just long enough. As the girl disappeared into the restroom, Michael straightened, adopting an air of casual curiosity. He walked back toward the man, who had just retrieved his keys and was looking around for the girl, a hint of confusion in his eyes. "She needed a restroom break," Michael offered, his tone friendly and conversational. "Hope you don't mind. I thought I'd let you know." The man's expression shifted from confusion to irritation, though he tried to hide it. "Thanks," he muttered, glancing toward the restroom with a forced smile. "I'll go check on her." Michael placed a firm hand on his shoulder, his grip gentle but unyielding. "I wouldn't worry," he said, keeping his voice calm but holding the man's gaze. "Girls that age are pretty independent, aren't they? Give her a minute." The man's mouth tightened, a flicker of something dark passing through his eyes. But he didn't argue. Michael released his shoulder, watching the man closely as he walked back toward his booth. Michael's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the room, knowing he'd bought only a small window of time. He hoped it would be enough. Several seconds later, the girl emerged from the restroom, her small figure darting toward Michael. He knelt down, meeting her eye level. She looked up at him, her gaze filled with a mix of fear and hope. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. She swallowed, nodding, but her eyes told a different story. "I don't know him," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He took me. He said if I scream, he'll." She trailed off, her voice trembling. Michael's stomach twisted with anger and horror. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his voice low and steady. "I'm going to help you," he said. "But you have to trust me, okay?" She nodded, clutching the fabric of his jacket as if it were a lifeline. He straightened, looking toward the man, who was now watching them with suspicion. Michael knew it was now or never. Taking a deep breath, he pulled out his phone and dialed 911, keeping his movements discreet. He knew he didn't have much time, and every second counted. "Hi, yes, I'm at the Ember Field rest stop," he said, his voice low but firm. "There's a young girl here who needs help. I'll keep her with me until you arrive." As he hung up, he felt a surge of relief and a renewed sense of purpose. He had the girl beside him, and the authorities were on their way. But the man was watching them closely now, his face darkening with realization. Michael steeled himself, knowing he might have to confront the man head-on before this was over. But no matter what happened, he was ready. He wouldn't let this man take the girl again. Not on his watch. The moment of truth. Michael kept the girl close, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder as they stood near the counter. He could feel her trembling, the residual fear emanating from her in waves, but her eyes held a glimmer of hope, a fragile light that made him more determined than ever. The man, however, had noticed their closeness, and now watched them with an expression that shifted from irritation to outright hostility. Michael sensed the man's mounting tension and knew he was running out of time. His thoughts raced, calculating the best way to keep the man at bay until help arrived. The minutes felt agonizingly slow, each second stretching into what felt like an hour. He made eye contact with the cook in the back, who gave him a small, supportive nod, confirming he'd keep an eye on the man if things got rough. The man rose from his booth, abandoning the pretense of nonchalance. He approached Michael and the girl with a controlled, almost chilling calmness, his gaze fixed on the child, with an intensity that made Michael's fists clench involuntarily. "Excuse me," the man said, his tone icy but polite. "I believe you're overstepping here, sir. My daughter and I were enjoying a peaceful evening before you decided to intervene." Michael held his gaze, standing his ground. "Is that right?" he replied evenly. "Funny, she just told me she doesn't know you." The man's mask cracked, his eyes narrowing with a glint of barely contained fury. He forced a strained smile, his hand twitching at his side. "Kids say all sorts of things," he replied, his voice low and threatening. "You wouldn't want to make a scene over a misunderstanding, would you?" Michael didn't flinch, letting the silence settle thick and heavy between them. His mind raced, searching for a way to keep the man talking and away from the girl until backup arrived. He could see the girl's small hand clenching into a fist beside him, her fingers curling around his jacket like a lifeline. "You're right," Michael replied, his voice calm but firm. "No need for a scene. But how about we settle this with the authorities? Let them clear things up." The man's face twisted with frustration, the calm veneer cracking. He glanced around, eyes scanning the sparse crowd in the diner. He was cornered, and he knew it. Yet Michael saw a flicker of something darker, a last-ditch attempt to escape with the girl. His gaze settled on her, calculating, weighing his options. "Look, sir," the man said, his voice dropping to a strained whisper. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing here, but this is my daughter, and you're scaring her." Michael shook his head, his expression resolute. "Funny. I think you're the one scaring her." The man's composure slipped entirely. In one swift motion, he lunged forward, grabbing for the girl's arm. She yelped, a cry that sounded too familiar, too rehearsed, as if she'd been through this terror before. Michael moved instinctively, stepping between them and blocking the man's reach with his own body. "That's enough," Michael said, his voice as cold and immovable as steel. His eyes met the man's, daring him to take another step. The girl huddled behind him, clinging to the back of his jacket, her small frame shaking. She was too afraid to look up, but she didn't need to. She trusted him, her fingers still gripping the fabric tightly, as if afraid he'd disappear. Michael felt her fear as if it were his own, each tremor of her hand fueling his determination. "Sir, I suggest you take a step back," Michael continued, his voice calm but carrying the unmistakable weight of command. "I've already called the police. They're on their way." For the briefest moment, the man's face twisted in rage, but he quickly masked it with an indifferent shrug. He stepped back, raising his hands in a mock show of surrender, though his eyes burned with contempt. "Fine," he sneered. "You think you're doing the right thing, soldier. You have no idea what you're getting into." Michael didn't take the bait, his face set in unyielding resolve. "We'll see about that." The man gave him one last look, his lips curling into a sneer, before turning away. He slumped back into his booth, his hand tapping rhythmically on the table as he stared out the window, his expression dark and brooding. Michael kept his body between the man and the girl, his senses on high alert, ready for any sudden movement. Minutes dragged on, and Michael felt the weight of each passing second. The diner seemed to have fallen into a tense silence, the staff and patrons picking up on the unease in the air. The cook stood in the doorway to the kitchen, arms crossed, watching the man with a stern look that held a silent promise of backup if things escalated. Just then, Michael heard the faint sound of a siren approaching, its wail growing louder as it neared the rest stop. Relief flooded his veins, and he felt the girl's grip on his jacket loosen slightly, though her small fingers still clung to him as if afraid he might let go. The man shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face a mask of suppressed rage and fear. He knew his options were running out. When the police cruiser finally pulled up outside, Michael felt a surge of relief and validation. He knelt down to the girl, giving her a reassuring smile. "It's going to be okay," he whispered. "You did the right thing." She nodded, her eyes still wide with fear, but there was a spark of relief in her expression, a silent thank you that made Michael's resolve feel even stronger. 2 officers entered the diner, their expressions alert as they scanned the room. Michael stood, meeting their gaze, and waved them over. As they approached, the man in the suit attempted to rise, a protest forming on his lips, but one of the officers gestured for him to stay seated. "Sir, I need you to stay right there," the officer said, his tone calm but firm. The man hesitated, his gaze darting between Michael and the officers before he sank back into his seat, his face twisted in silent fury. Michael turned to the officers, keeping his voice low. "This young lady doesn't know him. She's been signaling for help. I think there's more going on here than he's letting on." The officer nodded, glancing down at the girl with a soft, reassuring smile. "Hey there, sweetheart. Do you want to tell us what's going on?" The girl looked up at the officer, her gaze flickering nervously to the man before she nodded. She took a deep, shaky breath, her small shoulders trembling as she began to speak. He told me he was my uncle, but I don't know him. He took me from the park," she whispered, her voice breaking as she clung tighter to Michael. "He said if I didn't come with him, he'd hurt my mom." The officers exchanged a look, their expressions hardening. One of them turned to the man in the suit, his voice cold and direct. "Sir, we're going to need you to come with us." The man's mask shattered, his face contorting in anger. He stood abruptly, his voice rising in defiance. "You have no proof. I'm her legal guardian. This is all a misunderstanding." The officer remained calm, his expression unyielding. "We'll clear everything up at the station, but right now you're coming with us." The man's defiance faltered as he realized he was trapped. He gave Michael a venomous look, muttering something under his breath, but he didn't resist as the officers escorted him out of the diner. As the door closed behind them, the girl let out a small, choked sob, the tension in her body finally releasing. Michael knelt down beside her, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. "It's okay," he said softly, his voice steady and reassuring. "You're safe now. They'll take care of him." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and gratitude. For the first time since he'd seen her, she allowed herself to cry, her small body shaking as she let go of the fear she had been holding in. Michael stayed with her, his presence a steadying force as she processed the whirlwind of emotions. The cook came over, his expression softening as he handed the girl a cup of water. She accepted it with a small nod, taking a few shaky sips as her breathing began to steady. After a moment, one of the officers returned, giving Michael a nod of approval. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Without your vigilance, who knows what could have happened?" Michael gave a humble nod, his expression thoughtful. "I just did what anyone would have done," he replied, though he knew deep down that not everyone would have acted. He looked back at the girl, a fierce protectiveness settling in his chest. She had shown such bravery, despite everything. As the officer finished taking a statement from the girl, she turned to Michael, a small, grateful smile on her tear-streaked face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with a sincerity that struck him deeply. Michael smiled back, his voice warm and gentle. "You're a brave kid, you know that." She nodded, the corners of her mouth lifting into a faint smile. She reached out, taking his hand with a trust that made his heart ache with both sorrow and pride. He knew he'd remember this moment. The silent plea, the courage in her eyes, and the strength it took for her to hold on until help arrived. As the officers escorted her to their cruiser, Michael watched them leave, a profound sense of peace settling over him. He had come to the rest stop expecting nothing more than a break from his drive, but he was leaving with something far more valuable, a renewed faith in his purpose, and a reminder that sometimes vigilance and compassion were all it took to change a life. Unraveling the threads. As the police cruiser pulled away, Michael watched the girl's small figure through the rear window until it disappeared down the long stretch of highway. The diner had fallen into a hushed reverence, with patrons and staff alike processing the events that had just unfolded. Though the girl was safe now, Michael could feel the adrenaline slowly seeping out of him, replaced by a heavy, simmering anger and a pressing need for answers. He returned to his booth, his mind racing with the questions that gnawed at him. Who was the man? How had he managed to abduct the girl so smoothly that no one noticed? And most troubling of all, how many other children might have suffered at his hands? Michael looked over to the cook, who stood at the kitchen window, watching him with an expression that was equal parts gratitude and curiosity. The cook approached, wiping his hands on a towel, his voice low and serious. "You really think that guy was, trafficking her?" the cook asked, the disbelief in his voice giving way to horror as he considered the possibility. Michael nodded slowly. "It's a strong possibility. The girl didn't know him, and the story she told the officers, that he threatened her mother to keep her quiet. It's a common tactic used by traffickers. They manipulate kids with threats, making them feel too scared to run or ask for help. The cook's face darkened, his jaw clenched. It's sickening. How did you know, though? I mean, how did you even spot it? Michael exhaled, his eyes distant as he recalled the moments leading up to his decision to intervene. I could just sense it. Call it training, call it instinct, but I've seen that look of fear before, and I couldn't ignore it. The waitress, who had been watching from behind the counter, approached quietly, her voice filled with awe. "Thank you," she said softly, her eyes misty. "You saved that little girl." Most people would have just looked the other way. Michael shrugged modestly, but her words lingered. His military training had taught him to act when others hesitated, to recognize threats that others missed, yet this situation had struck him differently. This wasn't an enemy on a battlefield. This was a child, scared and alone, manipulated into silence by a stranger who should have never been near her in the first place. And even now, the memory of her desperate gaze, her small hand making that signal, remained seared into his mind. He realized that the man had left behind more than just a terrifying memory. This encounter had planted seeds of questions that Michael couldn't ignore. He wanted to know who this man was and what else he had done. "Do you guys happen to keep a record of customers?" he asked, glancing at the cook and waitress. "Like maybe a credit card record or a logbook?" The waitress shook her head, looking regretful. "No, sorry. Cash and card, but no records. Place like this, we don't really keep track." Michael frowned, but he wasn't deterred. His training had taught him that there was always a way to uncover the truth. Small clues, subtle traces left behind, if only you knew where to look. As he walked toward the booth where the man had sat, he noticed the remnants of the man's abandoned coffee, the newspaper he'd left crumpled on the table, and a small black leather notebook half tucked into the crevice between the booth cushion and the wall. The sight of the notebook sent a spark of excitement through him. It might hold clues, answers to the questions swirling in his mind. He pulled it free, flipping it open to the first page. Inside, the handwriting was small and meticulous, notes written in hurried, slanted cursive. The pages contained strange phrases, times, and locations, as if the man had been making appointments or tracking something. He noticed entries with times and locations followed by initials, each entry disturbingly precise. His eyes scanned the page, his stomach twisting as he realized what he was looking at. This wasn't an ordinary notebook. It was a log, a meticulous record of places, dates, and what seemed to be targets. The man had been using this notebook to keep track of locations and people, likely other children or victims. Michael's heart sank as he turned the page, scanning the list of cities and dates. Each entry felt like a new wound, a sickening revelation of a network far darker than he'd initially suspected. He reached the last entry and paused, his breath hitching. The name at the bottom of the page sent a chill down his spine. Emberfield, rest stop, 7:00 p.m. Ego. It didn't take long for Michael to realize who those initials represented. He was staring at a record of that little girl, her initials standing out like a warning sign, a grim reminder that she was only one name in a sea of many. She'd been chosen, targeted, recorded like a piece of inventory. The waitress, noticing his reaction, approached, her expression growing worried. What did you find?" Michael looked up, his face grim. "It's a list," he said, his voice tight with anger. This man was tracking people, possibly children. And that little girl, she was on his list. The waitress covered her mouth, horror dawning on her face. "Oh my God," she whispered. "So he's done this before." "Seems likely," Michael replied, shutting the notebook with a grim finality. "I need to get this to the police. This isn't just a random abduction attempt. It's part of something much bigger." He felt a renewed urgency to act. If the authorities had this notebook, they might be able to track down more victims, possibly even dismantle whatever network this man was involved in. Michael's military training was screaming at him to get this evidence into the right hands, to keep the momentum going. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. With the notebook in hand, he thanked the waitress and cook, who both nodded, their faces a mix of horror and gratitude. He stepped outside, the cool night air hitting him like a wave. The sky was dark, and the road stretched out ahead of him, silent and vast. But he wasn't going home, not yet. There was still work to be done. He called the police station, identifying himself and explaining the situation. He described the notebook, outlining what he believed it to be, and asked to meet with a detective who could take over the investigation. After a tense 15-minute wait, an unmarked car pulled up, and a plainclothes detective stepped out. The man was tall and lean, his expression one of practiced calm, though his eyes held a sharp intelligence. "Mr. Kane?" the detective asked, extending a hand. "Detective Isaacson. I understand you have something that might be of interest to us." Michael shook his hand, his grip firm. "Yes, sir. I found this notebook in the booth where the man was sitting. It contains dates, locations, and what I believe are targets. It's detailed, too detailed to be anything innocent." Detective Isaacson flipped through the notebook, his face darkening with each page. "Good Lord," he murmured, scanning the entries with a critical eye. "You weren't kidding. This could be part of something much larger." Michael nodded. "The girl he was with tonight. She's one of the entries." He marked her down like she was part of his schedule. The detective's expression hardened. "You did good spotting this. Most people wouldn't have noticed a thing. But with this notebook, we can dig deeper, see if there's a network behind it. We might be looking at a trafficking ring operating across state lines." The weight of the situation settled heavily on Michael's shoulders. He had walked into the diner that night thinking it was just another pit stop on a long journey, but he'd stumbled onto something sinister, something that would haunt him if he didn't see it through to the end. As Detective Isaacson took the notebook, he looked at Michael with a newfound respect. "We'll keep you informed," he promised. "And if we need a statement or any further help, I trust you'll be willing." Michael nodded without hesitation. "Absolutely. Anything I can do to bring this man, and anyone else involved, to justice, I'll do it." The detective gave him a nod, then slipped back into his car, taking the notebook with him. Michael stood there, watching the taillights fade into the night, a sense of satisfaction mingling with a quiet determination. He had made a difference tonight, saved a life, and unearthed a piece of a much larger puzzle. And while he knew there was a long road ahead for the little girl who would have to heal from this nightmare, he also knew that she would face it with strength and resilience. She had shown incredible bravery, and her silent plea had led him to act, to intervene. As he finally climbed back into his truck, Michael sat in silence, taking a moment to absorb the events of the night. He knew his life would go back to its usual routine, but he also knew that he'd carry this experience with him, a reminder that sometimes the smallest actions, like noticing a little girl's silent signal, could make the biggest difference. He turned the key in the ignition, feeling a quiet sense of pride, and drove into the night, knowing that this wouldn't be the last time he'd stand up when others couldn't. Ripples of justice. 2 weeks passed since that fateful night at the Emberfield rest stop, and Michael found himself replaying the events over and over. The image of the little girl's eyes, wide with silent desperation, haunted him, yet the resolution brought him a sense of peace. He had stepped in at the right moment, stopped something awful from unfolding, and handed crucial evidence to the authorities. But as he had feared, the nightmare hadn't ended with that night. One evening, as Michael sat alone in his modest living room, his phone rang. Recognizing the number as Detective Isaacson's, he picked up immediately, his pulse quickening. "Michael Kane," he answered, his voice steady but curious. "Mr. Kane," Detective Isaacson replied, his tone serious but tinged with something else, something akin to satisfaction. "I wanted to give you an update, as promised. Thanks to your intervention and that notebook, we've managed to piece together a significant part of this operation. Michael leaned forward, listening intently. I'm glad to hear that, Detective. How bad was it? Isaacson sighed. The notebook gave us far more than we expected. It wasn't just the names and initials of potential victims. It also had coded meeting points and a few names we believe are aliases. It led us to a network we hadn't fully mapped yet, operating across 3 states and involving multiple players, including recruiters, transporters, and handlers. A surge of anger and revulsion rose within Michael, but he kept his voice steady. Did you find more kids? Yes, we did, Isaacson replied solemnly. With your help and the girl's testimony, we were able to save 5 other children. They were on that man's list, marked with initials and times, each one of them like a ticking bomb waiting to go off. Your vigilance gave us a head start. The weight of that information settled on Michael's shoulders, both horrifying and strangely comforting. He hadn't just saved 1 life. He had saved 6. Have you been able to identify the man? Michael asked, his mind flashing back to the man's cold eyes and the way he had manipulated the girl with subtle but unyielding control. We've confirmed his identity. Name's Richard Calloway. He's been linked to a network operating out of a small city in Nebraska. Calloway was a recruiter, using his position in legitimate travel and business circles to avoid suspicion. He would approach vulnerable families under the guise of offering assistance or connections. If he saw a vulnerable child, he'd make them his next target. Michael felt a cold fury rising within him as he listened. Calloway had managed to blend into society, preying on the very people who needed help, hiding in plain sight. He had been close to walking away with that little girl without anyone the wiser. The thought left Michael cold. Has he confessed? Michael asked, already suspecting the answer. Detective Isaacson sighed, his tone frustrated. Not yet. He's smart, knows exactly what to say and what to hold back. But we have enough evidence to keep him behind bars until he's ready to talk, and with time, I'm confident we'll crack him. Right now, we're focused on dismantling the rest of the network. Every person he recorded in that notebook is a lead. Michael nodded, though Isaacson couldn't see it. The detective's words brought some relief, but there was still an uneasy feeling within him, the lingering sense that there was more to uncover. I'm glad you're digging into it, Michael replied. Anything I can do to help further, just let me know. Isaacson hesitated, then added quietly, Actually, there is something. We've been working with the girl's mother, and she mentioned that her daughter still talks about you. Apparently, she's been asking if the soldier who saved her is okay. The girl's counselor suggested that meeting you again, on her terms, might help her process what happened. Michael felt a swell of emotion he hadn't expected, a mixture of protectiveness and honor. I'd be more than willing to meet with her, he said softly. Anything that can help. The detective arranged the details, setting up a time for him to meet the girl and her mother at a small family support center. Michael spent the days leading up to the meeting reflecting, mentally preparing himself to face the girl he'd saved, unsure of how she'd react or what she might need from him. Finally, the day arrived. As he walked into the center, a small, quiet building filled with colorful posters and children's drawings, Michael felt an unfamiliar nervousness. He was led to a playroom where the girl and her mother were waiting. The woman stood when she saw him, her eyes filled with gratitude and a deep weariness that only parents of lost children could understand. Mr. Kane, she said, her voice soft but sincere, I can't thank you enough. You saved my daughter's life. Michael nodded, humbly shaking her hand. I'm glad I was there in time. Then he looked down to see the girl, half hiding behind her mother, her eyes wide as she looked up at him. The last time he'd seen her, those eyes had been filled with fear and desperation. Now, though she still seemed fragile, there was a flicker of something else, a timid curiosity. Hey there, he said gently, lowering himself to her level. Do you remember me? She nodded slowly, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that tugged at his heart. You, you helped me, she whispered, her small voice filled with wonder, as if she hadn't quite believed he was real until now. Michael smiled softly, nodding. Yeah, I did. But you were brave too. You were the one who signaled for help. Without that, I might not have known to step in. The girl seemed to take this in, her eyes searching his face for something she couldn't quite put into words. After a moment, she reached out and took his hand, her small fingers wrapping around his in a gentle but resolute grip. Thank you, she said again, her voice stronger this time. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude and respect for this young girl who had endured so much. You're welcome. You're safe now, and no one's ever going to hurt you again. You have so much courage, and you're going to be okay. The girl nodded, a small but genuine smile breaking through her solemn expression. For a few moments, they sat in a comfortable silence, her hand still holding his, her mother watching them with tears in her eyes. Eventually, the counselor gently stepped forward, nodding to Michael and the girl's mother, indicating that the session was nearly over. Michael knew it was time to let go, though he found himself reluctant to leave. As he prepared to say goodbye, the girl spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. If someone else needs help, will you help them too? The question struck Michael deeply. He looked her in the eyes, his expression warm and reassuring. I promise I'll always be there to help whoever needs it. And if you ever need anything, just remember, you're never alone. There are people who care about you, people who will protect you. She nodded, seeming to take comfort in his words, and after one last squeeze, released his hand. As Michael stood up to leave, he felt an immense sense of peace wash over him. Meeting her, seeing her courage and resilience, reminded him of why he had acted in the first place. She had endured something unthinkable, yet here she was, standing tall and brave. When he stepped outside, the sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the center's modest grounds. Michael breathed in the crisp evening air, his heart lighter than it had been in days. He had done his part, but he knew this wasn't the end. He'd continue to carry the responsibility of vigilance, always on guard for the silent signals others might miss. As he climbed into his truck and drove away, he thought about the ripples set in motion from that single night at a rest stop. His decision to act had spared a life, ignited an investigation, and dismantled part of a dark network. It had proven to him, once again, that one person's actions could change the course of many lives. And as he headed down the road, back onto the familiar stretches of highway, he knew with absolute certainty that he'd be ready again if the need ever arose. Because sometimes, in the quiet moments and unexpected places, people needed someone to watch over them, to notice, to care, and to step in when no one else could.